in. So we're looking at 5 topics, and the handout, sorry if it's scarily thick, but it does at least have all 5 in one, so there's no further next week, don't worry. So yeah.
Just hold it a bit closer.
Yes, yeah, thanks. But today we're going to look at sort of the case for Christianity, and we're going to begin by an introduction to apologetics, and then questions whether God exists or not. So that's what we're looking at. So just asking sort of what is apologetics? So it basically means to give reasons for something. And in that sense, Christian apologetics is giving reasons for why Christianity is worth considering. If you wanted a good textbook and a definition of this, so Graieg says Christian apologetics attempts to give a case for, Christian apologetics is the rational defense of the Christian worldview as objectively true, rationally compelling, and accidentally or subjectively engaging. The word apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which can be translated as defense or vindication. So there's a bit of ring. But the word apologetics was basically used in several contexts. One could be in like a lawsuit where someone was charged and they would say, you're guilty, this is what you've done. And if you're familiar with Greek, the word apo basically means away from. And if you know logos, like the word, it means you speak away the word. So you were given a word and said, they're guilty of this, and you sort of speak away. But it can just be used more casually as well. And today in apologetics, that's sort of how it is used. Just a few things to point out. It does sound like the word apologizing in English, but it really has no connection. Although in theory, maybe there are times when Christians have to apologize and say sorry for something we've done, but there is no connection. Apologetics may be known as sort of being arguing, argumentative, or quarreling, but again, you can give arguments, reasons for it, but it shouldn't be known for being argumentative. It's not, and again, just trying to say, here are these reasons, and how come you're so dumb you don't understand that. That's not that. Yep. And then likewise, it's related to evangelism, asking people to come to Christ, but it is distinct, which is to say, I really say you should focus on evangelism. And if people have questions, you address them, but you don't have to lead with questions like, let me prove to you why the Bible's reliable, or this or that. And so that's sort of basically what apologetics is. And we'll look at a few passages from the Bible, but are there any even comments on that? Just what is apologetics? Yeah, you could even get apologetics for why you think iPhones are better than Android or vice versa and stuff like that. That's giving your reasons for it. So it's pretty straightforward, even though it might sound a bit complicated. So there's several passages in the Bible to talk about it, one of which is 1 Peter 3:15 that says, "But set apart Christ as Lord in your hearts, and always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you about the hope you possess. Yet do it with courtesy and respect, keeping a good conscience, so that those who slander your good conduct in Christ may be put to shame when they accuse you." This is to say, apologetics shouldn't begin with giving reasons. It starts with Christ being Lord of your life, you knowing him, seeking to be transformed by him, and then sort of growing out that lifestyle of that. The idea is hopefully people come along and say there's something different about you, you've got a hope that's different. And so from there, you can trust in the Spirit to help give you questions, give answers to their questions and things like that. There's a lot you can unpack there, but that's where it's coming from. And again, if you're just wanting the word in the Greek, basically here to give an answer, I think the NIV has give a defense, is this word apologia, that it's coming from, apologetics. Yeah, there's several other places. In some ways, there's in fact a whole book of the Bible that's actually focused on apologetics. And so the book of Jude, it says here, "Dear friends, although I was very eager to write to you about the salvation we share, I felt compelled to write and to urge you to contend for the faith that was once for all entrusted to God's holy people." So saying that to contend for the faith, in some sense, to give reasons in this broad sense as well. And so this is a book where he said, I wanted to write about our salvation in this, but instead I want to do that. And he goes on to say, because there were ungodly false teachers who crept in, they reject authority, they are full of pride, but you are to build yourself up in the faith and have mercy on those who doubt, remembering that God is able to keep you. There's more in that, of course, but just skipping through there. And so here's a book that has that sort of emphasis in there. Beyond in the letters, you could even look at what was Jesus' perspective on apologetics. And there's a book, if you wanted to see further, but just sort of summarizing it. The authors basically argue that Jesus used reason, he uses evidence, he was holistic in that sense. It wasn't just purely academic, but he cared for people's needs, he met them where they were. He believed in the necessity of the Spirit to work in people's lives. Yeah, and he did meet them where they were, both in their questions and their issues and that. And so that's to say apologetics was something that Jesus did. We see the apostles and other disciples doing that too. And you actually can, if you were spending a longer time, look at it in the Old Testament as well. For instance, in the book of Isaiah, God says, come reason, though your sins are scarlet, they can be white as snow and things like that. There's other passages. And just to look at two last places in the New Testament that talks about this a bit is in the book of Acts. We see Paul in the start of Acts. It says, as was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. And so here we see sort of with a Greek audience, with a Jewish audience, he talks about the scriptures and how it talks about Jesus, and that's sort of his approach. And then later in the chapter, he's with some non-Jewish audience of Gentiles, and he has a slightly different approach. I'll just read through this. In Acts 17:22, it says, so Paul stood before the Areopagus and said, men of Athens, I see that you are very religious in all respects. For as I went around and observed closely your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Therefore what you worship without knowing it, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by human hands. Actually, I'm probably not touching the slides properly, sorry. As if he needed anything. But he himself gives life and breath and everything to everyone. Therefore from one man he made every nation of the human race to inhabit the entire earth, determining their set times and the fixed limits and the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope around for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. Sorry, doing it too soon. For since we are God's offspring, we should not think that deities like silver, stone, and image made by human skill or imagination. Therefore, although God has overlooked such times of ignorance, he now commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has set a day on which he is going to judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he designated, having provided proof to everyone by raising him from the dead. So there's a lot going on there, but basically what I was trying to highlight is that we see when the start of the chapter, when Paul talks with Jews, people who sort of trust in the authority of the scriptures, that's the sort of common ground, and Paul starts there. But then with this Gentile, this non-Jewish audience who don't have trust in the scriptures, he starts further back where the common ground is in sort of creation. He says the God who made the world, but then he still does move to Jesus. It's not like that's an optional thing, you can just skip that out. And so we can just learn some things here about approach, about how to go apologetics, what are the things. And I guess it's kind of like saying you can address the issues where you meet the people and sort of move towards Christ. And that's the sort of general apologetic approach we see in the New Testament. And that's generally what happens today in like your books you read and that. Any other comments just on scripture? How does it approach the idea of apologetics? Yeah, there are many others. In the handout, I think the first 6 pages are stuff that I'm hoping to cover, and then there's about 4 pages of extra stuff. And then, for instance, I've got some there about how to understand some passages that might talk about blessed through those who believe but have not seen, and stuff like that. So there's much more you could look into, and I'm just focusing on some main things like that. If there's no questions, we'll move on. And I'm just saying, if you wanted sort of for the whole 5 sessions, what I would say apologetics, like how to go about it, it's hopefully trying to cover here. So I'd say, how does one defend the faith? How do you give an apologetic? You're meant to know God, or know God and his word, and like live it out. And then when God brings someone along, as it's appropriate, and using your wisdom of what's to be said at that time, that situation, you want to state sort of what the Christian faith is in word and deed. And then prayerfully and respectfully, you want to ask if that person would like to trust, is Jesus their Lord and Saviour, and if not, why not? And then it's really only this part is apologetics. Then you sort of listen and respond to their questions. which is to say, yeah, you're not leading with apologetics, it's leading with a life in relationship with Jesus and being able to offer that and share that with others. But yeah, apologetics often comes in, people hopefully will accept Christ straight away, but if they have questions, which they regularly do, that's sort of where apologetics comes in and helps supplement that. And it depends what the question is, which is to say, if it's none of the stuff we're covering, that's fine. You don't have to refer to that. You would sort of be prepared and ready to address that. And so the stuff we're covering for the rest of the day is what I thought was some of the more common or important stuff. In saying that, yeah, there's lots of areas of apologetics. And some will look at, is there truth? Epistemology is a question of how do we know something? So how would you know what's true? And then there's challenges like postmodernism says, everything's relative, it's just subjective, that may be true for you but not for others. And those are all good questions, and we're unfortunately not covering any of that. And we're going to jump in some other stuff. So we're going to look at the question of, does God exist? And then, is Christianity true, rather than how do we know it's not just the Jewish God without the New Testament scriptures, or Allah, a Muslim understanding of God? So why the Christian God? That's the general structure we're looking at, and there could be objections to that, like doesn't evil disprove God, and that's some of the things we'll look at. But before we do, this one definitely is a question. I want to ask you all, what do you feel Christianity is? And I know there's a lot you could say there, and so the challenge would be, can anyone sort of say what they feel is the shortest way they could say it? Is how would you state what it is that Christians believe? Yep. Anyone? You don't have to, but... Yep, to live a life following the teachings of Christ. That's really good. I like that. Anyone want to add or say it differently, or you can challenge if you want to?
It's not a religion, it's a relationship with Jesus Christ.
Yep. Not a religion, but a relationship in Jesus Christ. Yeah, they're both great answers, and I wouldn't have an issue with that. That being said, the way just...
Well, I was listening to it just last night, I think. What Paul said, Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. He was buried, and he was raised the third day according to the scriptures.
Yep. Yeah, I like that. And I think that would be part of, following Jesus' teaching is assuming that he's died according to the scriptures and raised, and that. And so yeah, I would phrase it as, the shortest way I could put it is, Christianity is the belief that God raised Christ. And I guess the reason I put the word Christ rather than Jesus, and you would have to unpack all this, and that's to say, this assumes then, for God to raise Christ, that God has to exist. And we want to explain, what is God like? Does he exist? Who is he? And things like that. And it's, not just any old... In fact, there's been millions of people called Jesus. This is the one who was God's anointed king, the Messiah, and that. And it's to say, it wasn't just someone who did this. It's a significant figure and person of that. And then he was raised up, which implies, in a sense, he died. And if you look further into the scriptures, what they said is that Christ died for our sins. Yeah, you can say it different ways, but that's how I like to do it. And the relevance of this is what I've sort of structured around. So we want to see, can we show that God raised Christ? And so first we've got to say, well, if God doesn't exist, he can't raise Christ. And hence that's why I would be turning to that. Why do we think God exists? And then next week, it'd be looking at, did God raise Christ? Is there evidence for the resurrection? And that is, if you like, I've called this the case for Christianity. That's what we're covering in the first 2 weeks. And then we'll follow objections, like, doesn't evil disprove God, even though you thought that, maybe we were mistaken, and we'll move to them. But looking at this, so the question of, how do we know that God exists? So this can be done in different ways. So one instance you could say, well, the Bible says that. Like, it's been covering in the sermon series here with Pastor David Skirving, says Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created, which is it just says right there. And so, if you trust the Bible, it says right in the first verse, God created. He's there. Yep. And so if you do accept that, like for instance, if you met a Jewish person, hopefully they will accept that, and that's evidence and testimony of that. But in general then, there'll be people who won't agree with that. And so are there other ways we can appeal to them? And so you can use what's generally called general revelation. That is, if the Bible is special revelation, it is available to anyone who picks it up and reads it in that sense. but it was specially given to Moses, the people of Israel, and things like that. And so general revelation is just looking from creation in that general and say what can be known there. Yep. This is what's known as natural theology. If you like just theology, would be studying God, and this is studying nature and saying what does it tell us about God, about that as well. Yep, and you could say what's the basis if you wanted. And this is not issues I think you would have to cover with a seeker, someone who's not a Christian. But I guess for Christians, they might say, well, why do we want to do this? Why not just focus on what the Bible says? And that's great. It does have a place, but I'm just saying there may be times when people are objecting to the Bible and we can still use natural revelation then with them. And in this sense, I would say Scripture itself seems to point to this value in natural theology or in general revelation. So it's not something that's like foreign ideas against that. It's pointing, in a sense, to some way that all truth will be God's truth. It needs to be rightly interpreted in creation, otherwise it could be a bit ambiguous. But yeah. So yep, jump on. So before we get into an argument for God's existence, I would want to say that these arguments are not like a proof in the sense of like a mathematical, it's shown that anyone who rejects this is irrational. Rather, these are just things that are a matter of more probable than not. And as long as something is more likely than not, then you're rational in believing it. So even if you could say it's 51% likely, that's enough for someone to accept. You might be able to say, no, I think I can show it's 80 or 90 or 99.99. That's fine, but as long as you're able to show, in a sense, it's 50.1% likely, then that would be enough for it to work. And so yeah, it's not like in the category of proof, it's that. This sort of comment here about logos, ethos and pathos is saying again, humans are sort of holistic, and so it's not just about reason, the sort of logos, the reasons, but it can also include the ethos, which is sort of your character, being someone who's set apart Christ as Lord, being transformed. And that's to say, if you almost treat it as a proof, people may say, yeah, fine, you've proven it, but if that's what you Christians are like, I'm not really interested in someone who's this intellectual bully or something like that. And then also pathos is to say then, how you go about it can be done in engaging ways, which is to say in some ways, things like J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings or C.S. Lewis's Narnia, also like a case for Christianity, but done in a much more imaginative way, still presenting the Christian worldview and story. And that's by all means, you can make that sort of case for it. A few more things before we get in. One is to say who has the burden of proof, like whose responsibility it is. And I would generally say anyone who makes a claim, whether it's positive or negative, they're the ones who have to back it up. So if theists are saying there is a God, they need to give reasons. If an atheist says there is no God, they need to give reasons for that as well. The sort of default position that is not required is what you would call an agnostic, or particularly a weak agnostic. If someone says, well, I don't know. There can be what you could call a hard agnostic, who says, I know that you cannot know. And then they're making a claim that no one can know, and they know it. So they would have to give reasons for that as well. But yeah, it's just to say apologetics is this mainly the aspect of loving God with our minds. And so you do have to sometimes establish like who's required to show what. Again, before we jump into reason, it's worth considering, like, why does this matter? Sort of who cares? And it's generally conceded that if God doesn't exist, then there is no objective meaning or purpose to life. Morality is just subjective, and then there's no hope for the future, which is to say, sadly, we will all one day die. All humans will one day die. The sun will burn out. Every single star in the universe will also burn out, and there will be nothing left. So no matter whether you were a Mother Teresa or Hitler, you've all got the same outcome for you and the universe and fate. Nothing would have mattered. And that's to say, it's not an argument for God then, but it's just to sort of say that's the consequences. And I would say, given that, it seems like it's really worth checking out. Like it would make all the difference in the world whether or not there was a God and this sort of question, and so it's definitely worth checking out. I think I haven't paused for ages. So are there any comments or questions on some of the stuff we've covered so far? Yes.
What if an atheist says to you, well, God doesn't exist and there's just no reason and, sorry, this doesn't exist, and I feel stuck because I think, well, what do I say to this person?
Yeah, so for what we've covered so far, I'd just be saying like, yeah, that is the glim reality. But if there is a God, then it could mean that there is meaning and purpose in life. It could mean that, you know, what we do today and for all eternity could matter. So basically saying it's really worth looking into. And I would say there are some reasons that have people have found convincing for, you know, thousands of years and many people today, and so it's worth checking out. But right now this is just checking out, and this would mainly be for someone who you could call an apatheist. That's to say someone who just doesn't care, and they're like, I really don't care about Christianity, about God, why does it matter? And it's saying, like, think about why it matters, and it makes a huge difference. That's all. Yeah.
I came across a person the other day, and she said to me, I'm a Christian agnostic. Oh, what is that? I asked her, what is that? She couldn't tell me. Oh, I
Yeah.
sort of half believe in God. So have you come across that term, and what do you think it means?
Yeah, I think I have used that, and generally it's best to let people define themselves. Even if someone says they're a Christian, there's diversity amongst that, and so you can ask, and they'll be the same. And we haven't, I did kind of define the term atheist as someone who doesn't believe in God, but there's at least one other way of defining atheism, and that is namely someone who lacks a belief in God. And so they're saying, well, you don't say that you're an atheist, right? You don't really think that Thor exists, and so, yeah, you don't call yourself an atheist. You just lack that belief. Yep. And we'll get back to your question, but I'd say, to me, that's not the best definition, because this podium is also an atheist, an atheist, in that it lacks that the belief that God exists. It lacks every belief. As far as we know, most animals are in that category. And so still the question, does the proposition, does God exist, is that true or false, still remains. And so I think the traditional way of understanding atheism as belief that God doesn't exist is better, but if they want to define themselves that way, that's fine, and you'd sort of ask them. And so the same with if they're calling themselves a Christian agnostic, I'd just ask them sort of what they mean by it. But it sounds like they're a Christian who is not sure about that. And in some ways that could be almost what I've been saying of here, that I don't think it's proven with 100% certainty. Yep, but I mean it could be something else, like, yeah, and so I just want to know in that sense. Anything else, or we'll move on? Yep. So yeah, like, I feel like we're about to get into argument for God's existence, but apparently I've got more introductory matters. One of which is, I guess we can explain what do we mean by God. And I actually do think this is, yeah, actually very important and significant, which is to say, if, like someone like Richard Dawkins, who would say, you know, God is a bully, a crazy guy who lives in the sky or something like this, and would say, yeah, I don't believe in that God either. That's true. But, you know, what is God? And there's different ways that people have defined God. But I would say, particularly if this third one, God refers to the greatest possible being, or someone who is maximally excellent, of which there could be none greater. That's like I'd say, like, that is the most amazing thing, period. It's more interesting and greater than anything in the universe, the whole universe put together. Yeah, and the idea that we could even know or have a relationship with him is just completely amazing. And there could be nothing greater you could think about than that if it did exist. And so that's what we mean by God, and that's sort of what we're talking about. Yeah, we're not talking about these sort of made up, you can even hear about God as a flying spaghetti monster or something like this nowadays. And that's just sort of silly. It's not in the same category at all. So having said that, yeah, so what are some of the arguments for God's existence? You are welcome to use any that you like. There's 4 or so traditional ones that have been used for more than 1,000 years. Some, like the cosmological argument, would be like a couple thousand years old, which sometimes may make you feel like, well, if they haven't proven it in 2,000 years, like, what's the point? But it also say it hasn't been disproved in 2,000 years, and it's a matter of more probable not, and these things have been discussed by ancient Greeks before the time of Jesus, and they're still discussed in most universities and philosophy departments and stuff around the world. And so these are, sorry to use big terms, but it's just if you Google it, you get the right hits. That is the cosmological argument from the Greek word cosmos, which basically means universe. And so it's an argument that says, is the universe a reason for thinking that God exists? Then there's the teleological argument. You may know this from Jesus on the cross, says, it is finished. That is the word teleos. And so yeah, it's basically saying, is there a design and purpose in the universe? The third one is the axiological argument, and this is the Greek word for values, of which there's two main types. There's moral values, which is what we're going to look at. Is morality a reason for thinking God exists? And then there's aesthetics, like beauty. Is beauty a reason for thinking God exists? And generally Christians say, yes, he is the greatest conceivable being. He's not only morally perfect, he is the perfection of beauty as well. And the church fathers have said to see God is to have the beatific vision, to be face to face with God is to see like pure beauty, stuff like this. And then finally there's the ontological argument, which is the Greek word ontos, which means nature or being. And it's to say, is there something about the very nature or being of God that might suggest that he exists? And you could also have arguments from experience, but we're not covering any. And if you did want to see more, I guess people, myself included, write too much. And so here's a book that has, I think, 25 or so arguments for God's existence. So yeah, and you could have your own one, that's fine. People have come up with like arguments for music and mathematics and things like that as well. But they're the main ones anyway. And so I want to jump in and to say the first one we're looking at is the cosmological argument. And so this is saying, is the cosmos, the universe, a reason for thinking God exists? Not to complicate matters further, but there's different types of cosmological arguments, and this is what's known as the Kalam cosmological argument, and it's formulated in this particular way by a guy called William Lane Craig. Got a photo there. And the Kalam cosmological argument is basically saying, if the universe had a beginning, that's a reason for thinking that God stands behind it. But you could have other ones. There's been arguments that said, no, even if the universe is eternal, it could still have God behind it and things like this. Anyway, this is this. If you did want, I believe the word kalam is the Arabic word for logos, and it's named so because while this argument did not begin with Muslims, it was greatly developed by Muslim scholars in the Middle Ages, and so in honor of them, it's been named that. And this is again to say that this is argument for God's existence. Right now, it doesn't say whether it's the Christian God, Jewish God, or that. It's just saying, is there God, as in the greatest conceivable being? Does he exist or not? And so here's three premises, and these are just sort of statements or claims, and you need to ask what reasons are there for actually thinking they're true. But it can be phrased like this. 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore the universe has a cause. And so you'd need to unpack that and look in that. And to do so, I'm going to play a 4-minute video, which I didn't actually pre-test, so I'm just hoping the sound is going to work. We'll do that. If you've got any questions, we'll see what you think of this after that. Oh, it didn't work when I skipped it. Sorry, my bad.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, Everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedman and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time. More recently, three leading cosmologists, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, proved that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to this, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
Any comments or questions about that one? Kalam cosmology argument. So that's a 4-minute video that you can also find on YouTube and Facebook, and message people if you like.
Yeah, awesome video. Thank you for that. Just a question. One of the things they did talk about was the multiverse. They kind of quickly dismissed that, but a lot of scientists do still hang their hats on that belief that our universe has been sprung from other universes. What would you say to that?
Yep, and so in general I would say with all these things there's layers of complication that can go on, and somewhere in the book I recommend extra reading. I see it's the very last, if you turn the page just before the word extra notes. Sorry, I think the book I'm using doesn't have good spacing, that's my fault, sorry. Well, I don't remember it being all copies, but anyway, it has more resources at Why Christianity, and I think on there you can probably get over 100 pages of just listing of resources, which is scary for me included. But yeah, that would address some of the things on both sides. But in short, I think the best way is what the video did, to say the theory says that any universe, including a multiverse, that is on average expanding would still have a beginning. So it just pushes the questions back, but it still remains that. So it's not an objection or something that's troublesome. It basically says, yep, so where did the universe sort of begin? What's its start? If they said that that's eternal, then in a sense, that wouldn't apply to this argument. This argument would fail. but I would say then there are other cosmological arguments that assume that the universe didn't have a beginning and they can still sort of work. Yeah. Yes?
Why would the universe expand?
Yes, why would it expand? So again, with all these arguments, you could have different reasons. And so some Christians and non-Christians would say that seems to be talking about the Big Bang, and they may be skeptical of that and say, yeah, I don't agree with the Big Bang, and the Big Bang basically assumes that you had a singularity, a small point that expanded, hence you've got an expanding universe, and they're saying that's based upon evidence of light being redshifted in all directions, suggesting that it's moving away, hence if you go back in time it was closer, and hence this is expansion. Yeah. So that's sort of what it's based on. But yeah, if you, whatever reason, didn't like that, they gave other reasons, such as the second law of thermodynamics, like wholly apart from the Big Bang, would seem to say that there's a certain amount of energy and then it's running out, which would imply a beginning as well. This video, in some ways I think wisely, it looks at scientific evidence for this. There is another video of which you can find on that link that looks at just philosophical evidence, and it would say that, yeah, wholly apart from science, any theory, you can also say that philosophically the universe very likely had a beginning. So there's other ways of arguing for it, but it's short there. And so in some ways, you could even say, I don't know what your view of the Big Bang is, but the person you're talking to, you say, do you accept the Big Bang? That implies a beginning. So, on your assumptions, it says that with like the expansion of the universe. Yeah, I guess with all these, I think it's good to talk about, different reasons for if they come up. Like, if that's their question, I don't think gods exist. I think the stuff you can. Ultimately, you probably should have already begun by saying, look, I know you've got issues with that, but let me just tell you what Christianity is first, okay? And then we can see whether or not it's true. So you can sort of present Christianity and say, Christianity is that God raised Jesus, that God loves you, he has a wonderful plan for your life, he died for you, he rose again to forgive sinners like us. And then you can say, like, if your issue is God not existing, we can come to that, but like, let me explain the gospel message first, and maybe they may find, actually I've got more issues with that, I'm not. And you can see sort of what their reasons is. And I would want to say, you need to say that the standard is more probable than not saying I can prove it, but yeah, aren't these suggestive reasons? Yeah, that sort of were. Anything else? There are several other arguments. We've got roughly 20 minutes I'm trying to keep to, and I was planning to skip a few, but there's the theological argument, fine-tuning. Some people find them more stronger than others, and that can be your opinion. I think I've heard someone like Christopher Hitchens, the late atheist, said like he thinks this is the most convincing. I think the video for this one is 6 minutes, which is why I was skipping it, because that other one was shorter. Yep, I did want to stop on the moral argument though. Yep, this one doesn't appeal so much to science, and so I think it's actually more stuff. But yep, so I see your questions first. Yeah. So the question is, for the theological argument, which I skipped over, it says that there's 3 options. So this argument assumes that there's fine-tuning, which the vast majority of scientists do accept, but not all. So some people say, no, the universe is not fine-tuned. The video and discussion would have to get into that. The kind of things it would say is that if the strong nuclear force was just a bit stronger or just a bit weaker, we wouldn't have any attraction between electron and protons, and so you just couldn't have any matter to begin with. You can do fine-tuning on different scales, and this video, and I personally think it's stronger to make that for the sort of fundamental constants of the universe. And some people do it more to do with our present reality. Like they'd say, if the Earth was too close to the sun, like Venus, it'd be too hot, and so you couldn't have life. And if it's too far away, like Pluto or something, it would be too cold for life. So it can't be too hot, too cold, but that's just right, and that's sort of fine-tuned. And they'd actually say there's hundreds of these factors that go into that. But yeah, so it's assuming fine-tuning, and then it's saying there's 3 different explanations for it. One is just physical necessity, meaning it just had to be that way. We don't know exactly why they're on, but it is that way. And there's not many people take that route. The very idea of a multiverse disproves physical necessity because it says there is not one, but there are in fact many. There's multiple of them, so that would be that. So that's to say multiverse would generally be a chance way of doing it, and saying like, you know, we just got lucky because, yeah, the odds are if there's, I think it's normally 10 to the 500 possibilities with multiverses that you've got it. Or one option is to say that it was design. And I think if you look at the chance hypothesis that actually say even on a multiverse, life seems to be unlikely with that amount anyway. But yeah, I'm sort of skipping this, but that's definitely a valid question. Happy to chat further. And if not, there's further resources you could look into for this. Yeah, I would say they are independent arguments as well. So let's just say even if they thought this one failed, you could still consider the cosmological argument. Or I'm going to suggest you could still consider an argument from morality. And so yeah, that's what I wanted to look at here. I think it's another sort of 5-minute video, but I'll play it anyway. You can phrase this in different ways, like C.S. Lewis has known for a moral argument, says things like, you wouldn't consider a line crooked unless you've seen a straight line. You wouldn't say that there is darkness unless you've seen light and things like that. And yeah, there's different ways you can phrase it. So this is, I guess, a more philosophical way of putting out in premises. And the 3 premises are: 1, there are objective moral facts. Actually, sorry, I apologize. The video does not use this wording, so I feel like I should use the wording of the video. This is taken from, I think, the resource there. So this is the version I prefer. Rather than the one in the video. They're pretty much the same, so we'll just go with this, sorry. Premise 1, there are objective moral facts. 2, God provides the best explanation of the existence of objective moral facts. Therefore, God probably exists. So that, again, so it doesn't say it's proving it. It says, given that if you think morality is objective, not everyone does. Some people think it's relative, and it will be discussed a little bit in the video. And I guess particularly nowadays, the video with morality, most people don't really care whether or not you say something about entropy or the Big Bang, but with morality, it's going to talk about, you know, is murder or rape bad, and so just saying that. But let's play that video, and you can see what you think of this.
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is, neither what. Rather, God wills something because he is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to then is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
Any comments or questions about the moral argument?
Atheists' argument about morality, how do they determine it? Do they say that it's just inbuilt, that we all have a common morality that's inbuilt?
Yep. There's going to be different responses, so I guess it depends. You could ask them, how do they explain it? And generally, people will sort of rotate between the two. So they may often start by saying, yeah, everything's relative, it's just subjective, right? Because when one asteroid bashes into another asteroid, it's not doing anything wrong. And life and animals are the same thing. We don't arrest a cat for eating a bird, and we are just highly evolved monkeys, and we're not moral. That we have moral categories, but they're not actually moral for not like just objective reality. So yeah, they'll often sort of go that way, but then in a sense you ask them and say, yeah, that's right, we should everyone in prison is just unjust, and you never sort of want to use harsh realities which say you don't want to win the argument but lose the sort of the battle overall. But the same thing is, no one just says, yeah, it's alright, people can just rob my house, it's okay for people to do war and kill other people. We say, no, that's wrong, like that's objectively wrong, it's not just that. And so you tend to sort of gravitate between the two. And there are ways, and not to get complicated, but the atheist can ground morality. It's normally done through Platonism. And this is the idea that there exists the Platonic realm of ideals, that the reason that this clock is round is because there exists roundness in the realm of the forms, in like Plato's views, and that this clock just is a shadow or participation of that perfect roundness. And so you could say that there just is justice and morality and stuff like this and exists. But I'm yet to meet an atheist who on the street who says that, and I know a few books that make that kind of argument, and most of them in practice would say, yeah, things are relative. And in theory, they can bite the bullet and say that, but just saying no one really lives that way. And so, yeah, unlike with, say, the cosmological or teleological arguments where you sort of tend to start arguing about scientific facts and, I don't know, a multiverse and, well, some theory said this and the force of something, this is, yeah, much more to home, and I would think most people deep down would admit this. I would not recommend doing this, but I think it was Francis Schaeffer who, when faced with someone who said, yeah, I don't believe in objective morality, picked up a kettle and held it over their head. And yeah, and they, yeah, I wouldn't suggest doing that, but some people have done that. So, does that help? Or, yeah. Yes.
I've heard that sometimes they think of moral, like being moral is a social construct. They argue that I'm being good because I'm taught that way by the society. I think that's one of their arguments.
Yeah.
This is like socially formed.
Yeah, but thank you, that's a good comment. So yeah, several people might just say it's just our society, that's what we were taught that way. And to some degree, so that was covered in the video, namely you would say that, well, there was a time, according to evolutionary story, when there was no creatures that had eyes. So the physical world didn't exist, right? And so just because we've evolved the capacity to see doesn't mean that there's actually an objective world here. Yeah, and you'd say that seems crazy, and that's the same with morality. There was a time when, yeah, there was organisms that didn't have a moral consciousness, but our experience of the moral realm is just as much proof it exists, that the physical world exists through our other senses and stuff like that. Yeah, and so unless they're really willing to say that, yeah, you're right, we were totally unjust to the Nazis because they were just following their laws, that was their culture. But yeah, if you're going to say no, is there not a law above our law, and it's grounded ultimately in God, yeah, it doesn't seem to have a good basis for morality besides that. Yes?
Well, if they atheists say, well, we've evolved into these moral beings, how do they deal with the reality of the world where there's wars and people violently hurting other people, things like that? How do they justify that?
Yeah, and that's to say, I would say they ultimately don't have a foundation of that. So again, I would say with the moral argument though, we have to admit there's a lot of bad things we've done, even sadly, by those who call themselves Christians. But these would just be an example of there are objective moral values and duties, including the bad stuff you'd see or that they could mention. And so unless they're willing to say, you know what, like that kind of C.S. Lewis, like why would I get upset if the whole show from A to Z was bad and I'm just a part of it? You know, unless you can say that there is a standard, you go realize it's, yeah, your moral intuition, your sense there is pointing towards God, that there is some sort of foundation and basis for that. But yeah, in theory, sort of any instance they can complain about the church just is an example of objective morality does exist. So I've got about 5 minutes left for my time. So any questions, I'm happy to chat later, but I'm saying the fourth major argument, which I'm also not planning to look at, but just to let you know, and the main reason I'm skipping this one is I'd say it's the most complicated one of the lot, but it some Christians may think this doesn't work, and if you're on that boat, that's fine. There were other arguments, but there are several Christians who think, no, this is sound, and sound in philosophy meaning it's a argument that is logically correct, and it's more probably true than not. And this basically says the only thing that matters is the first premise. Is it possible that a maximally great being exists? I said basically that's to say, is it possible that God exists when God is a maximally great being? And it basically says, if you think about the nature of God as a maximally great being, that if it's just possible that he exists, it turns out that he does exist. And that's, well, you say that sounds weird and crazy. And yeah, so you have to look into a bit more, but it's saying that's basically the ontological argument. Because it's saying there's some things that, yeah, can fail to exist, like human beings like myself. My parents could have failed to meet and never been born. But you're saying God's not like that if you think about what he is. And so perhaps God is impossible, like a square circle. There's no such thing as a square circle anywhere in any multiverse or things like this. But saying God, if he does possibly exist at all, he would exist everywhere. Yep, that's basically what it's saying. But we'll skip that one. Yep. And so just a few final thoughts is to say, again, these arguments, as long as it's more probable than not, they follow. And I don't think we can actually have this mathematical precision and say, well, I think it's this strong and that. But just for the sake of illustration, I would say, if you could show that they're more probable than not, say 51%, that would actually though mean, if you do the maths, that it's actually the conclusion is only 26% likely. So in theory, you need to have about 70% likeliness for each premise, and then it shows the conclusion would follow as being more probable than not. Alternatively, you might have said, well, yeah, I thought it was only 50-50, which gives me that 20% likeliness. But if you had multiple arguments, like the cosmological argument and the teleological argument, if you do the maths, and you have to add it inversely, I'm not great at my maths anymore, because you'd say, sorry, 26 plus 26 is 52. But if you did it that way, then, if you had 4 arguments, you get 104%. And so you'd be doing something wrong with the maths. And so you're meant to add it inversely. And yeah, so for instance, if you had like 3 arguments, then it could be like 59%. And I'm saying, I actually don't think those percentages matter, because say that's just not how we work. Maybe Klingons do. But in general, it's just saying more probable than not, and you can do this. And you can use a multiple of them, and so maybe they may find it convincing when they see that. Having said that, there's something called Pascal's wager, and I think this is best used in the case where someone's unsure, which is to say, this is basically asking, is it worthwhile believing in God? Is it worthwhile sort of betting on God? To say if there was a jackpot where, you buy your ticket, and if you win, you sort of win with God, or do you lose? Not. And I would say, if you really think that God exists, then go with that. Like, you don't have to bother about this. But this is really for someone who's unsure, saying, listen, but yeah, maybe. This would sort of say, okay, look, pause and think again, what's at stake? And it basically says, look, if God exists and you choose to believe, like if you place your $1 bet on him, the reward is like heaven for all eternity. It's like getting an infinite amount, like more than $1 trillion back. And, it's just like your one life, like maybe 100 years or something. If you choose to disbelieve and God exists, well, you've wasted this life. You could have gone to football on Sunday more and you'd missed out. I'd technically say that some studies have shown that actually people who go to church are happy and healthy and live longer lives anyway, so it may not be that bad in the end. But anyway, as it goes, you've wasted this life. But it's just a finite loss if God doesn't exist in that. If God, sorry, I think I pointed the wrong square there, sorry. This side I didn't see what I was pointing to. But if it turns out that God exists and you choose to disbelieve, it's saying the several religions say you've got a hell before you, and you've got eternal punishment, and so that's like a huge loss. It's like you put your dollar in and they've said, you know what, you've now got to pay, like you're bankrupt for all eternity kind of thing, so not good. Whereas the final category is if God didn't exist and you chose to disbelieve, okay, fine, you gain this life, you can do anything you want with it. But the point is, it's like $1. It's like, what were you going to spend on anyway? What were we going to do with those 80 years? It's like, it's ultimately meaningless. And so this, having said this, is not an argument saying that, yeah, therefore God exists, but it's just saying, consider what's at stake and then look into it a bit more. And you can't force yourself to believe. Just like if someone said to you, do you believe, like, I don't have the money to give you, but if someone said they'd give you $1 million, if you could just believe there was a purple elephant like dancing around this room, you can't force yourself to believe stuff like this. But it would basically say then, put yourself in a context where you can consider it. Like, go to church, there's people there who believe, and see what they say about it. Read the Bible or this and check it out. And then maybe you may come to believe, you may see there actually are some good reasons for it and looking into